What's up, everyone? Despite popular belief, you don't have to host your Next.js or Payload CMS project on Vercel. You can, in fact, self-host every single part of your application. Or you can use another hosting platform like Railway. In this video, I'll show you how to host your project on Railway. I'll also cover why you might want to use an alternative hosting method at all. If you want the code I use in this video, there's a link to the repo in the description. Now, let's dive in. There are plenty of reasons to use Vercel. First, they make it very easy to deploy a Next.js project. Vercel sponsors the maintenance of Next.js, so it makes good business sense that they would make it as easy as possible to deploy Next.js on their platform. Second, everything about Next.js just works on Vercel. The image component, for example, may optimize images even outside of Vercel, but when you use that component with Vercel, without any configuration, it automatically serves your images through Vercel's global CDN. So what's the problem? You pay for that convenience. And sometimes you pay a lot for that convenience. Yes, everything just works, but that may mean that your under-optimized site may cause pricing issues as Vercel tries to make your project work and scale. You may find yourself battling with optimizations within the Vercel platform just to get your site to be within the thresholds that Vercel allows. You also can't use the Vercel free plan for commercial purposes. So as soon as your app ideally starts to make money, you are no longer able to use the hobby plan with Vercel and stay in compliance with their terms of service. Beyond that, you may hit usage limits that may make your app untenable on the hobby plan without even making any money at all. While Next.js just works on Vercel with zero configuration, you are able to implement every single key feature of Next.js outside of Vercel. If you want a CDN, for example, Cloudflare offers a generous free tier for their R2 object storage. In fact, if you know how to set them up, there are no shortage of CDN options out on the market. Revalidation, both time-based and on-demand, both work right out of the box on projects not hosted on Vercel. Even Canary and beta features are available when self-hosting. So it may take a little bit more time initially to get your project set up, but hosting your project on platforms other than Vercel is not only possible, but it's often preferred. I hope you now understand why you might want to self-host or use an alternative service. Avoid the big Vercel bills and choose to self-host or use another service. I'll be covering how to deploy your Next.js and Payload CMS project on Railway, but just know that there are many other platforms out there that allow you to host your Next.js or Payload CMS project with very little hassle. In my next video, I'll cover how to self-host using Docploy. Railway is another hosting provider like Vercel, but with much easier pricing management. It's all usage-based, so you're in full control of all of your services. Even better, you can create databases and S3-compatible object storage within the same project. A quick note, though, that Railway's S3 buckets are currently in beta, or what they call priority boarding. You'll need to opt in by going to the feature flags part of your account in Railway. This is only available on paid plans with Railway. Railway uses internal networking, which means you don't need to expose any part of your project to the internet for things to work together. With internal networking, Railway doesn't charge egress for anything on those private networks, which is just another way that Railway can save you money. Let's get started. I'm going to use Payload's website template to show this off. So first, I'm going to navigate to where I keep my tutorial repos, and then I'm going to run a command that's going to be pnpx create payload app, and then I can name it Railway hosted example. So name this whatever you want your project to be named. And I'm going to use the -t, which is the template tag, and I'm going to use the website template. It's then going to ask me what database I want. I'll use Mongo, and then I'll just take the default connection string. Now that this is created, I'll change my directory to my Railway hosted example. And then I'm going to run git init to initialize the Git repo, then add everything to the repo, and then commit it using the comment initial commit. Now, this step is optional if you don't plan on using GitHub or another Git provider to push your project to Railway, but I do plan on doing that. So we'll now go to WebStorm, and I'm going to open this project. And now in WebStorm, I can go to my Git settings, go to GitHub, and then share the project on GitHub. I'll just leave it named Railway Hosted Example, make this public so I can share it with you all. And then I'm going to share it to my NLV Codes GitHub. and make sure I log in. Now that the project is pushed to GitHub, let's get signed up with Railway. We're going to use Railway's CLI for most of the work here, but in order to use the CLI, we need to have a Railway account. If you don't already have a Railway account, go ahead and create a new one by clicking Sign In. Now, I've included my referral link in the description, and this is an affiliate link. So if you end up clicking on this link and making a purchase, I may receive compensation based on purchases you make after you click on the link at no extra cost to you. If you plan on deploying from GitHub, go ahead and continue with GitHub, or you can log in using an email and log in with email or continue with Google. I already have an account, so I don't need to go through this process. Once the account is created, download the CLI tools. The installation method you choose will depend on your machine. I've used Homebrew, but I've linked other ways to download the CLI tools in the description. So over here, I'm just going to run brew install Railway. So now I've already installed this, so it's going to update my Homebrew. When I did this at first, I did have to make sure that my Railway version was downloaded correctly and as the most up-to-date version. If you've never installed the Railway CLI tool before, this should not be an issue. Once the installation completes, you should be able to run Railway login. It'll ask you to open the browser, and I'll hit yes. It'll open in your default browser, and here you can see that there was an error logging into the CLI. This happens to me at times, so I'll just copy this command, which adds the browserless flag, and try running that again. And here it's telling me to visit this site, which I can't click on, but I'll need to copy and then paste. And you'll just make sure that this is matching your pairing code from the terminal and hit verify. And now I can close the page. And now that you're logged in, you should see this returned where it says logged in as your account name. Now we can get started on creating our Railway project. So at this point, I've already used the terminal to navigate my directory into my project directory. But if you haven't already, go ahead and change your directory to the project you just created. Once you're in, you can run Railway init to initialize the project, and the workspace is chosen for me. You can leave the project name blank for a randomly generated project name, but I'm going to put in Railway hosted payload CMS. And when I hit enter, it'll tell me that it created a project called Railway hosted payload CMS on my projects. Now I can start adding services. So I'm going to add first a MongoDB, so I'm running Railway add. This is going to add the services. The D flag here is for databases, and I'm looking for a MongoDB. Other options do include Postgres and a few others, but Mongo and Postgres are all that really matter for Payload CMS, so I'll hit enter. And it added MongoDB to my project. And that's the name of the service, which we'll check here in just a moment. Then we can add a service for our actual application. So I'll run Railway add, and you'll be prompted to choose the type of service you want to create. I'm going to choose GitHub repo, since that's where I put my project. And then I'm going to type in my NLV codes, and then Railway hosted example. I'm going to press enter to skip variables. We'll come back to that. And I'll add a service name, which I'll just call app. Since I have my Railway project set up to take repos from GitHub, it found my Railway hosted example from my GitHub repo and created a new service called app and linked to it. If you don't want to use GitHub to deploy your project, you can use other Git providers and use CI/CD to get your project deployed to Railway. The problem though is that those Git providers aren't deeply integrated with Railway quite yet. In those cases, you can select an empty service and set that stuff up later. The next thing we'll set up is our S3 bucket. As of the time of this recording, buckets are not generally available, so I can't access them through the CLI, so we'll need to create it in our Railway project. In order to get to that, I'll just run Railway open, and in my default browser, it'll open this project in my browser. Here we can see the MongoDB as well as my app here. I'm going to rearrange this so app comes above the MongoDB, and you can see here that it's trying to build the app. I don't expect this build to complete because I don't have any environment variables set quite yet. Now over here, I'm going to right-click on the canvas and click Bucket, and the bucket's going to be created successfully here, we can see. And then if I click over to credentials, you'll see that we need to deploy the bucket in order to get our credentials set. So I'm going to first change the bucket name to just be S3 to make it easier for me to remember, and then set the bucket region to whatever is default here. But keep in mind that the buckets region cannot be changed after it's created, and then I'm going to deploy, so then I can see the credentials here. Now that we have all of our services set up, let's get started on generating our environment variables. But before we do, make sure you like this video and subscribe to my channel. You also have the option to become a member of my channel. Members receive exclusive perks to my channel like early access to videos and more. Thank you for your support. Now let's get back to it with environment variables. Let's start with the bucket. Since we have the credentials pulled up, you can see that there's this handy add to service button. So I'm going to click this and I'm going to set service to app and the style to AWS SDK. And I'm leaving it set to this style because I know that this is how Payload CMS's S3 storage adapter takes its environment variables. So I can just hit add variables and we can see that 6 changes have been applied. And if I come over to my app, I can see in my variables those 6 environment variables added. You'll also see that an arrow has been added to show me the relationship between my app and the other services in my project. This is just a way for us to stay organized and see at a glance how our different services are related to one another in this project. Now let's click on our MongoDB service, and for me, database was selected automatically, and now I can select connect here. We're going to need both the private network and the public network MongoDB strings, but first let's start with the private network because it's going to be easy to copy that. And go over to our app, go to variables and add a new variable. So I'm going to click add new variable and I'm going to call this database URI because that's what Payload's templates use as their database connection string. And then I'm going to paste MongoDB, Mongo URL, and hit add there. Next.js requires a database connection at build time. This is how Next.js is able to generate static sites built from a database. You can bypass that, and I'll show you how to do that in the self-hosting video that's coming up next. But with Railway, there's another way forward. You can expose your database to the internet only during the build phase. After your project builds, you can use the internal connection string that we just pasted here. This will help reduce egress cost, but will still allow you to use static generation at build time. Let's set that up by using a conditional check in our Mongoose adapter here in our payload config. But first, above our build config, we're going to have a constant called isBuild, and we're going to set that to be process.env.build and set that equal to true. Then we can come below to our Mongoose adapter. Now in our URL here, we're going to check if isBuild or if our node environment is equal to development. So this is allowing us to also use our external database during development. But if you want to use a different database or a local database, you can add that here instead. And we'll check if that's true. If it is, we're going to use the environment variable called build database or an empty string. Otherwise, we'll use the database URI that we set up. That means that we'll need to add this build database environment variable as a new variable, which will just be build database. And here we're going to start typing in a $sign with 2 curly braces and then MongoDB. And then we can look for the public URL and then add that. Now we're not done over here. We need to go to our package.json, which is down here. And in the build script, we need to add that build environment variable here and set it to true. So now down here, we see while that build script is happening, isBuild is true. And since it's true, it's going to use the build database. But once it's out of the build phase and is in start or running, isBuild changes to false, which then allows me to use the database URI, which will be the internal network here in Railway. Now, these database strings need a few things before I can move on. So I'm going to go to the raw editor. And then for both build database and database URI, I need a database name. So I'm going to use Railway hosted example. And then also at the end, I need to set my authentication source, which I'll set both to be admin. So now I can copy all of that and add it to database URI and update the variables. Now to use my bucket, I need to open my terminal and run npm add payload CMS storage S3 to install the S3 storage adapter. Then once that's done, I can import our S3 storage from Payload CMS storage S3 and scroll down to the plugins for where the storage adapter placeholder is. I'm going to include S3 storage for my media collection, set that to true. And then I can set my bucket to be the environment variable from my Railway config here, which is going to be AWS S3 bucket name or an empty string. Then we'll need our config, which will have our credentials, which will have an access key ID. And that will be our environment variable AWS access key ID or an empty string. And then we need our secret access key, which will be our environment variable AWS secret access key or an empty string. Then we need our region, which will be, again, process environment variable AWS default region. And then it's important that we include underneath region our force path style and set this to true so that we can start serving images from our S3 bucket without extra configuration. While we're in our payload project, why don't we copy over our payload secret and generate a next public server URL. The payload secret is required by all Payload CMS projects, and the next public server URL is a variable commonly used in Payload CMS templates. It's definitely in this one. We can set these by copying my payload secret, and then in our terminal, we're going to make sure that we're connected to the right service. So I'm going to run Railway service, and we're going to select app. Then I'm going to run Railway variables, and then I'm going to set the variable using quotes and just paste in the payload secret. Now, instead of using the terminal to generate an environment variable for our next public server URL, I'll create a new variable here and copy our next public server URL here, and then search for our public domain and hit add. This domain doesn't exist yet, but it will after we generate it here in just a moment. And before we deploy this project, we need to make a few adjustments to the project itself. The first one is to go over to our next config and change our remote patterns. I'm going to remove this next public server URL. And then in remote patterns, I'm going to first add host name of localhost, which will have the protocol of HTTP. And then I'm going to do this again, but this time with host name. And I'm going to check the process environment variable of next public server URL. I'm going to split it because I need to add the HTTPS to Railway in order for this to work. And we're going to take just the host name and then include the protocol of HTTPS. And I can delete the rest of this information here and then add a comma here. And then that's done. We also want to make sure we don't have local storage enabled in our media collection. So I'll go to collections, go to media. Railway uses ephemeral data storage, so any images or objects added to the Railway instance we have will be deleted each time the site is rebuilt. So I can go to upload, and we're going to comment out our static directory and instead use disable local storage and set that to true. Next, here I'll just run Railway domain, and we can see that the domain already exists on the service. Before you run Railway domain, you may need to run Railway service to make sure you're connected to the proper service. Now, before we do anything else, we should generate our types. So I'll run payload generate types, and then payload generate import map. And then the last thing I'll do is delete the Docker compose and Docker file here in the project. And the reason I'm deleting these is to ensure that Railway doesn't try to build this project from the Docker files. I want it to deploy using Railpack, not Docker. Once that's done, we will exit that and hit deploy down here on our canvas. And this will try to build again, but we've made some changes to the code. So I'm going to cancel this deployment and then come over to my WebStorm project, and we're going to add and commit these changes with the message made changes. And then I'm going to push this to our main and let it deploy from here. Now I see that the build actually failed because my next public server URL is splitting at HTTPS. The problem though is that when a domain is generated with Railway, the public server URL doesn't include HTTPS with it. So I'm going to add that and then update the variables and then hit deploy. And now this change should be good since I already have the new Git deployment running here. Assuming it all went well, this should build with no problem, even with static site generation. With Railway's CLI tools, you can develop locally using your production environment variables from your Railway project. So I didn't change anything in our environment variable file, so let's go ahead and actually just delete it, and I'll refactor. And now if I run Railway run pnpm dev, I should be able to go to localhost 3000 and see my project here, no problem. If I go to /admin, I'll get my first user creation, and I can just add my email with a test and hit create. And I see my whole project here. Now, if I go to my production URL, I can go to the admin dashboard, and I can log in now with those same credentials. If you're using GitHub, you can always trigger a rebuild by pushing new code to your connected GitHub repo. But if you don't want to use GitHub, you can use Railway up in order to deploy your code from your local instance to Railway with no problems. Remember, as always, you may need to run Railway service again to make sure you're connected to the correct service when you hit Railway up. To make things even easier, once buckets are generally available, I will be releasing a Railway template that follows all of the same steps that I just did, but in a one-click deployment type of manner. Let me know in the comments if that's something you'll use. Now that our project is built and we've confirmed that we can access our database both locally and in production, let's go ahead and create a new page. We'll call this page About, and I'm going to add some content. And I'm just going to add a media block. And I'll just click and drag any image over here with some test alt description and hit save. And we can see that media was successfully created, and I can publish these changes. And our slug is about, so I can go to my production URL, go to about, and we can see our image shows up no problem as well. So we know our bucket works, our database works, and our project overall works. And that's all there is to it. You've now deployed a fully functioning website to Railway using Payload's website template. Coming up next, I'll go over how to deploy a project on a VPS using Docploy. If you found this video helpful, please like it and share it with others who might also find it useful. Consider subscribing to my channel so you never miss when I release more content about Payload CMS, Next.js, and more. You also have the option to become a member of my channel. Members receive perks like early access to some videos, as well as an invite to my private Discord server. There's a link to become a member of my channel in the description. If you have suggestions or questions, please leave those in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Until then, I'll see you on the next one.